What if the world didn't change, but our maps did? Before 1900, entire lands appeared on maps, names detailed and widely accepted, only to vanish later without explanation. Not gradually corrected, just gone. Maybe they were mistakes, but if so, why were so many people so certain they were real? In 1531, a French cartographer named Laurence Finet published a world map that included something unexpected. At the bottom of the map, beneath South America and Africa, he drew a large landmass. It resembled Antarctica. This was more than 2 centuries before the official discovery of the Antarctic continent in 1820, and yet the outline, while not accurate by modern standards, appeared deliberate. Not a vague suggestion, but a defined shape labeled as a southern land. Finet was not alone. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, European maps often included a vast southern continent known as Terra Australis. It appeared in different forms, sometimes stretching across the bottom of the map, sometimes broken into fragments. Cartographers such as Gerardus Mercator and Abraham Ortelius included similar features in their work. At the time, this was not considered unusual. It was theoretical, a balancing landmass. Geographers believed that large continents in the northern hemisphere required a counterpart in the south to maintain equilibrium. It was an idea rooted in classical philosophy, rather than direct observation. The simplest explanation is often correct. They were filling in the unknown. But when you look at these maps today, something feels different, because Terra Australis was not always drawn as an abstract shape. Sometimes it included coastlines. Sometimes it connected to other lands. Sometimes it appeared detailed enough to suggest knowledge rather than speculation. And it was not the only anomaly. Pre-1900 maps are filled with places that do not exist today, or at least do not exist in the way they were once depicted. Large islands appear in the Atlantic Ocean, labeled and named, only to disappear from later maps. Inland seas are drawn where none exist. Entire regions are outlined with confidence, then quietly revised or erased in subsequent editions. Consider the island of Hy Brasil. It appears on European maps from the 14th century onward, often located west of Ireland. Circular in shape, sometimes described as visible only under certain conditions, it persisted in cartography for centuries. Ships searched for it, reports were made, and yet no confirmed landmass was ever found. Or take the Sea of the West, a large inland sea that appeared on 18th century maps of North America. It was drawn with enough confidence to influence exploration routes. Later expeditions failed to find it. It vanished from maps. Then there are coastlines. Early maps of North America, Africa, and Asia often contain distortions, not just in scale, but in structure. Peninsulas appear exaggerated. Rivers connect in unexpected ways. Mountain ranges are placed with uncertain accuracy. This is expected. Cartography before modern surveying was imprecise. Explorers relied on partial information. Coastlines were mapped from ships. Inland regions were often based on second-hand accounts. Errors accumulated. Corrections took time. But some changes are more difficult to explain through simple inaccuracy. In certain cases, features appear consistently across multiple maps from different cartographers, then disappear entirely within a generation, not gradually corrected, just gone. Maps are not static records, they are interpretations. Each one reflects the knowledge, assumptions, and limitations of its time. And before 1900, large parts of the world were still being explored, measured, and understood. That alone explains much, but when you compare maps across centuries, a pattern begins to emerge. Places appear, persist, and then vanish, not always with clear explanation, sometimes replaced with blank space, sometimes with entirely new geography. Perhaps these were simple mistakes, misreported sightings, cartographic traditions repeated without verification. That is the standard explanation, and it accounts for most cases. Still, the persistence of certain features appearing on map after map across different regions and time periods raises a quieter question. At what point does repeated error become something else? Because maps were not drawn casually. They were tools used for navigation, trade, and exploration. Errors had consequences, and yet some of these vanished places remained on maps for centuries before being removed. Why? Perhaps the answer lies in how knowledge was transmitted. Cartographers often copied from earlier works. A feature included on one map could propagate through generations of maps, gaining credibility simply through repetition. Authority reinforced assumption, assumption reinforced authority, until new evidence forced a correction. That process can explain a great deal, but not everything, because in some cases the corrections themselves are abrupt. A landmass present in multiple editions simply disappears, no annotation, no explanation, just absence. Maybe it was nothing more than improved measurement, better data replacing older assumptions. That is how science progresses. Still, the visual effect remains. A shifting world, a geography that seems less fixed than we assume. And that leads to a deeper question. Not whether these places ever truly existed, but why so many maps, across so much time, seem so certain that they did. Certainty, in early cartography, often came from repetition rather than verification. A coastline drawn once could be copied dozens of times. A reported island could appear on map after map, gaining authority with each reproduction. By the time a feature had been included in several major atlases, it began to feel real, even if no one had actually seen it. This process is visible in the persistence of so-called phantom islands. High Brazil is one example. Another is the island of Saint Brendan, which appeared in the Atlantic on maps for centuries, based on legends of a voyage by the Irish monk Brendan the Navigator. Reports of sightings were recorded well into the early modern period. Ships claimed to approach it, then lose it. Fog. Distance. Optical illusion. Eventually, it disappeared from charts. Then there is Sandy Island. Unlike medieval phantom lands, Sandy Island appeared on modern maps well into the late 20th century. It was charted in the Coral Sea between Australia and New Caledonia, included in shipping records, and even appeared in digital databases. In 2012, an expedition found nothing at its reported location. Open ocean. The island was removed. Even in an age of satellites, errors can persist. Looking further back, the pattern becomes more pronounced. In North America, early maps often depicted a large inland sea west of the Rocky Mountains, the Sea of the West. French cartographers in the 18th century, including those influenced by reports from explorers and traders, drew this feature with considerable detail. It suggested a navigable route from the interior of the continent to the Pacific Ocean. An appealing idea. Expeditions searched for it. None found it. Over time, the sea disappeared from maps. Not gradually refined, simply removed. In South America, similar anomalies appear. Certain river systems were exaggerated or misconnected. Mountain ranges were misplaced. Entire regions were depicted with confidence that later proved unfounded. Again, the explanation is straightforward. Limited exploration, second-hand reports, wishful thinking. Maps was much about possibility as reality. Still, the rhythm of appearance and disappearance continues. Feature added, feature repeated, feature accepted, then suddenly gone. No longer useful, no longer defensible. Replaced with blank space or corrected geography. This pattern reflects the evolution of knowledge, but it also reveals something about how information was trusted. Cartographers relied heavily on sources they could not independently verify. Reports from explorers, traders, and sailors were incorporated into maps with varying degrees of scrutiny. Some were accurate, some were not. Distinguishing between them took time, and sometimes a long time. At this point, a different interpretation occasionally surfaces. A small number of researchers suggest that certain vanished features might reflect real observations of transient phenomena landforms that appeared temporarily due to geological or environmental conditions. Volcanic islands that emerged and eroded, sandbanks that shifted, ice formations misidentified as land. There is evidence that some islands have appeared and disappeared over relatively short timescales due to volcanic activity or erosion. In that sense, not every phantom feature is purely imaginary, but most widely cited examples, High Brazil, the Sea of the West, are not supported by physical evidence of past existence. The mainstream view remains consistent. They were errors, persistent, reinforced, and eventually corrected. The simplest explanation is often correct. Still, There is something about the collective nature of those errors that stands out. Different cartographers, different regions, similar patterns, features that gain credibility through repetition then vanish when challenged. It suggests that maps are not just records of geography, they are records of belief, snapshots of what people thought the world looked like at a given moment. And belief can be surprisingly durable, especially when it is shared. Even as exploration expanded and measurement improved, the process of correction was uneven. Some errors were fixed quickly, others lingered, sometimes for centuries, and when they finally disappeared, the transition was rarely dramatic. No announcement, no correction notice, just a revised edition, a new map, a different shape, the old one quietly forgotten. Perhaps that is what makes these vanished places feel unusual, not that they were wrong, but that they were once treated as right, and that the shift from certainty to absence left so little trace in the record. Maps are often treated as fixed representations of reality, but historically they were closer to evolving documents, constantly updated, revised, and reinterpreted as new information became available. Before the 20th century, that process was slower, more fragmented, dependent on individual reports and limited communication networks. This meant that uncertainty could persist. A feature might remain on maps not because it was verified, but because it had not yet been disproven. Absence of evidence was not always enough. Removal required confidence, and confidence took time. In the meantime, maps carried both knowledge and assumptions side by side. Coastlines that were accurately charted, interior regions filled with conjecture, islands reported but never confirmed, seas imagined as connections between known points. Over time, exploration reduced these uncertainties, surveying techniques improved, navigation became more precise. By the late 19th century, large-scale mapping projects began to standardize geographic knowledge. Institutions like the United States Geological Survey and similar organizations in Europe worked to create consistent, evidence-based maps. Gradually, the unknown spaces shrank, and with them the features that had once occupied those spaces. But removal is not the same as explanation. When a feature disappears from a map, it is often replaced with corrected information, but the reason for its original inclusion is rarely documented in detail. Why was this island believed to exist? Who first reported it? What evidence supported it at the time? In many cases, those questions remain partially unanswered. The map changes, the record moves on, the earlier version becomes a historical artifact rather than an active document. This creates a kind of archival silence, not a deliberate omission, just a lack of emphasis. The focus shifts to what is known, not what was once believed, and over time the earlier beliefs fade. Maybe it was nothing more than the natural evolution of knowledge. Errors made, errors corrected, progress. The simplest explanation is often correct. Still, the pattern leaves an impression. A world that once appeared more fluid, less fixed, where geography itself seemed to shift not physically, but in how it was understood and represented. For the people using those maps, the features were real enough to navigate by. Ships plotted courses. Explorers planned routes. Decisions were made based on what was drawn, even when those drawings later proved inaccurate. Today, satellite imagery and global positioning systems have reduced that uncertainty to near zero. The map and the territory align with unprecedented precision. There are few, if any, places left that appear on maps without verification. And yet, the older maps remain, records of a time when the world was still being assembled in pieces, when blank spaces invited speculation, when repeated ideas became accepted geography, until they didn't. Maybe I'm connecting dots that were never meant to touch. It is possible that every vanished land, every missing sea, every altered coastline can be explained through the accumulation of small errors and gradual correction. In most cases, that is exactly what happened, but the visual affect the appearance of places that once existed on maps and now do not create a subtle tension, not about the land itself, but about certainty, about how easily something can move from accepted reality to historical curiosity, drawn with confidence, copied with authority, then quietly erased, leaving behind only the maps that still show a version of the world that no longer matches the one we recognize, a world that was, for a time, believed to be complete until the next version replaced it. Today, the map feels final, measured by satellites, verified down to the meter. There are no unknown continents left to discover, no phantom seas guiding ships into open water, no islands waiting to appear where none should be. Everything is accounted for, or at least it feels that way, but older maps tell a different story. Not of a changing Earth, but of a changing understanding. A world where certainty arrived slowly, where repetition created belief, where something could exist, not in reality, but in agreement. Drawn, copied, accepted, until it wasn't. Maybe it was nothing more than error, corrected over time. Maybe every vanished land has a reasonable explanation, but the maps remain, quiet records of a time when the world was less fixed than we imagine. And when you look at them closely, it's hard not to notice how confidently they once showed places that are now completely gone, as if, for a while, they were real enough to be remembered, even after they were erased.